Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition to what I'm calling the Professor's Ponderings Home Discussion Part 2. That's a very catchy name. I'm sure everybody will just hop right into it. So what this is, I'm Damon. I'm one of the pastors at First Presbyterian Church, Hastings, Nebraska. If you're watching this, you, I assume, already know what is going on, but we are in the midst of reading through this book, Home, by Marilynne Robinson. And we're having some sort of conversations about it as we go along. I am joined this morning by three members of First Presbyterian Church in Hastings, and I will let them introduce themselves once again. And Anne, we'll start with you.
Oh, thank you. My name is Anne Fairbanks Bolke, and I'm a retired English professor at Hastings College. And it's been lots of fun for me to be involved in these discussions.
Very nice. And Constance.
Likewise, I am a retired English professor from Hastings College, and I agree with Anne. This has been a lot of fun.
And Jenny.
Jenny Welsh. I am currently still teaching college English, but I don't often teach literature courses. So I will echo everyone else that this is lovely.
Very nice. So we are in the novel, or at least I am. I know that some of you have already read this book multiple times, but I'm up to page 150-ish is where I am. Let me just check to make sure. Yeah, spot on, 150. There's my bookmark and everything. So about halfway through the novel, and we start to, at least in this part of the book, folks were much more, there's a lot more conversation in this part of the book, and people sort of actually talking kind of to each other instead of just at or around one another, or trying to avoid each other kind of as much as they could. So I don't really know where to start. There's kind of lots going on, but I think maybe a good place to start is something that you three picked up on the little notes that we shared that I kind of completely missed. And it has to do with Reverend Bowden himself. And Constance, you sort of pointed out, and others also noted, that he really is like a child in this book, and maybe that's a good place to start, and maybe if you could just say a little bit about that.
Well, it seems to me that everybody tiptoes around him, and perhaps always has. I mean, there's enough in the childhood background to suggest that they've always gone along with this idea that they're a big, happy family, and they have all this fun, and maybe they do to some extent, but they really have to shore up that notion for their father, and they continue to do that as they look at, when they come home, they look at family albums and laugh, and he always says, yes, yes, what a handful you were, and what good times we had. And, but he, especially now that Gloria and Jack are home taking care of him, because clearly he's declining, he certainly calls the shots. Everybody has to jump.
Yeah, even his sleep schedule, like everything kind of revolves around his sleep schedule, just as it would particularly for a newborn child. Others kind of noticed this as well, I think.
Yeah, when I read Constance's notes, I was like, yes, that's exact. I mean, it's just, I get that caring for an elderly parent, it's that whole cycle of life, and, those who cared for you when you were little, then you're caring for them as they're older. but it is very much, he is, like you said, Constance, he's running the show, and it all is revolving around keeping him comfortable, keeping him, I guess, trying to make him happy, although I'm not really sure that's ever actually achieved. I mean, there's just a sort of feeling of ongoing trying, and a lot of things that just get repeated throughout the book is what I'm noticing. There are so many conversations where it's like, didn't we just have this? Didn't you just apologize? And I said, I forgive you. And on we go again and again. So I don't know, they're trying to figure out life, and they're trying to navigate as, in terms of Glory and Jack, as grownups who have come home.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, it's often, you think about, I try to imagine what it's like, because I live in a town where I didn't grow up. And so I think about going back to an elementary school, and what would my elementary school look like to me now? Well, I think it would look little, right? I'm older, and so it would look small. And so what's it like to come back to the house you grew up in when you were little and be there as a grown-up? I think is a lot of what they're dealing with too.
Yeah. Anne, did you want to hop in earlier?
Yeah, I noticed those things as well. And I think part of the way Reverend Boughton is kind of regressing is morally. And maybe he always would have said this, but, and I thought that, you know, Constance zeroed right in on this, that when the TV shows that must have happened in Montgomery, Alabama in about 1956. And, you know, part of the civil rights movement, and the police, you know, the fire hoses and the dogs. And I mean, just this dreadful scene. And the thing that bothers Reverend Boughton is that Jack says something that, well, quote, he says, Jesus Christ. I mean, he is commenting on the inhumanity and the horror of the scene, and Reverend Boughton doesn't seem to respond to that at all. It's just Jack's language. And he has some other, you know, kind of, to me, they're not really, I think the kindest way to say it is that they're not mature moral reactions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's yeah, the TV showing up is interesting. Jack he's been at the hardware store. He's noticed people stop talking when he walks in, and he's been watching the television, and then kind of talks Glory into having one sent to the house, and essentially so that he can watch the news, so that he can know what he doesn't like to listen to the radio, I guess, or that so that they can know or that he can know what's going on, right? And this, like, to me, this also connects with this idea of Boughton acting and behaving as a child as well, in that I get the sense that in that, like, Jack wants his dad to grow up also, and to evolve and to I don't know, think differently about what's going on in the world. I think during that conversation, Boughton says something to the effect of, well, you don't really need to pay attention to this because everybody's just going to forget about it in a little while anyway. And I think also this conversation points out something that you folks pointed out as well, that Jack, I think, sees this as a hypocrisy in his father, right? That as a pastor, I would presume, preached about love and all that sort of thing, and yet doesn't seem to be extending that to folks during the civil rights movement. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think
his,
that-
oh, I'm sorry,
that
go ahead.
makes
Ann.
sense. Oh, I'm sorry. You know, having been, you know, I was 10, you know, I was about 10 at that time. And I was living in Cincinnati, and I can remember that, and we went to the Presbyterian church, and all of the emphasis at church, I don't remember anybody ever saying anything about, you know, like civil rights or anything like that. It was all about like individual piety, you know, say your prayers and you know, respect your elders, and you know, in really pretty superficial ways. And so I think there's I mean, sadly, there's kind of a realism. I think that that's the way a lot of people who would think of themselves as Christians responded. And the other thing I'd mention that again is kind of reality was at that point, families that thought of themselves as my family did, as, you know, people who were thinkers and readers and interested in the broader world, it was a big deal to decide to have a TV in your home that would have like silly comedy shows. You know, at the time they thought of, you know, the Honeymooners, you know, how dorky is that? And, you know, we could be reading Dostoevsky, you know, but instead, you know, we're watching Leave It to Beaver and aren't we going to hell in a bucket, because intellectual hell in a bucket because of that. And so this business of, well, you know, should we get a TV and that stuff, I can remember that. Also, I thought it was interesting that part of Jack's excuse for the TV was saying that his father could watch baseball on it. And that was it in a lot of homes. I think that was the tiebreaker,
Yeah.
was that you, and that was of course a golden age of baseball. So
So
yeah.
do we think that the hardware store, because they were very accommodating, they're like, well, you take it and you try it, and if you like it, we'll put up an antenna. I'm wondering if that was a common offer, or if that was like we've said, like so many people seem to cater to the Reverend. Like, is that just another accommodation that's being made for him to like, well, let's make sure he's happy about it first. And then ironically, he's not thrilled with it, not taken with it, isn't the one watching it, but it does stay.
You know, actually, I can see that kind of thing happening in Hastings now. I mean, seriously, you know,
Yeah.
there's stores in you know, it's kind of a Midwestern small to medium sized city thing, I think.
Well, that's true.
Although it certainly follows the pattern of catering to the Reverend.
Mm-hmm. Notice I'm just going to call him the Reverend instead of trying to say his name. That's my get around.
The Reverend. It's Jenny, you said something that stuck out to me that I thought was interesting. The TV stays in the house, even though the Reverend doesn't have any interest in it really. But if the TV is a sign of sort of the changing times, right? The fact that the TV stays, whether or not the Reverend wants it there, I think also just kind of says something about just the winds of change in general, that change is going to come into all of our lives, whether we really want it or not, or whether we think it's a good thing or not. And I think that also connects with some of the generational differences that are going on in the book as well. But I hadn't really quite made that. So thanks for using those particular words.
I wonder too, it's so interesting because I agree with you all when you say that everyone is catering to the father in this situation. And also everything still revolves around Jack. And so I don't know if the TV stays because he's like, well, if I keep the TV, even though I don't like it, then I get to keep Jack. Jack wanted the TV. So if I don't get rid of it, then I won't also lose him.
yeah, that's not made explicit, but certainly we hear again and again that the good reverend does not want to risk losing Jack,
Mhm.
and certainly not losing him again.
Um, it's interesting me talking about this sort of idea of who's acting as like a child and who's not acting like a child. I think at one point, and I kind of forget all of the context, but the Reverend says to Jack, "I'm sorry, I've been treating you like you were a young boy, when you're now a grown man." And there are times, it seems to me, where Bowden's just kind of has these sort of I don't know, blurts of honesty or something, like in the similar way that you might expect a child to say something without really thinking about, oh, that's really going to offend somebody, and maybe I shouldn't say that. Like, and everybody kind of has moments like that in the book, it seems to me as well.
I noticed in this section, I don't know, I mean, maybe it was happening before, but I made a mention in my notes just in the book at like Bowden being more testy with Jack. Whereas when Jack was first initially home, it was, you know, all just, oh, you're here, and like celebration. And now that that has kind of worn off, yes, he still wants him to stay. He wants to keep him, but there are those blurts that are coming out sometimes that, yeah, I don't know if that's them settling into their patterns of being together, or if it's right his own regression and his own more childlike behavior that we're seeing come out.
Or is it honesty that finally breaks through?
Right. Years and years
because
of
he's been, yeah, so careful around Jack, and then he says these things he probably could or should have said when Jack was a boy or a youth, that he did not say then.
mhm.
We've had a lot of conversations well, we've spent time talking about the Reverend as a father and sort of debating this, well, why didn't he just lay down the law with Jack? He never seems to have offered Jack any sort of real consequence for his wayward actions. And there's a part in here where Bowden offers a defense to that. He talks about sort of everyone sort of assumes that everybody else can have complete control over their household, even though they can't have complete control over their own. And he talks about he was what he felt like he was really dealing with was that Jack was just sad for some reason, and was acting out of sadness, and he didn't think that punishing sadness was the proper response. And I don't know if that stuck out to folks, or if anybody, what folks think of that or not. But
well, I'm still trying on this idea that Jack has been responding to the family and even to Ames or people in the town because he's so opposed to hypocrisy, and he may see hypocrisy in them.
what is the hypocrisy that you think that he's seeing?
Well, I mentioned the incident with Trotsky, quote unquote, you know, the man who starts farming his Reverend Bowden's property without asking. And that relates back to the town wanting to earlier the town wanted to put a road through his property and he objected because it was his property. And this is in the section we discussed last time, but I had to go back to it where the mayor says under his breath something like, "You old hypocrite." And I think the hypocrisy is that he's preaching that, you know, God gives us what we have, and certainly he has been given what he has. He has not earned this property on his own. And he is, as a Christian, a steward of property, not an owner. And yet he's not really willing to think about the greater good for other people.
There's
And
oh, go ahead.
no, you
Well,
go ahead.
there's a mention near the end of this section, because I am also on page 150 exactly, where Bowden is offering money to Jack, and maybe Glory too, I don't know, but like he makes some comment that reminded me of what you were just talking about, Constance, in terms of like, well, it's almost like he's realizing, well, I have this money, but I got this money because I got it from my parents, and you can sort of see the wheels spinning too about like, well, I got this house and I got all this, you know, and here I was holding on to all this stuff when I could have been giving it to my children and helping them further their cause, whatever that might have been, sort of thing. So he's, I don't know. I think there are some for the father, and I know you were talking about Jack and some of his hypocrisy with things, but there are so many layers to this in terms of the relationships and the conversations and the issues.
Yeah. Yeah. But even like, oh, I'm sorry, Anne, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, when we don't, I don't think really find it out until this section that they've had this big house free and clear. I mean, think about it in people's lives, how much of their income, if you don't have a free and clear house, and most people don't, has to go toward housing, and had to go toward housing even then. And they also have income from this farm property. And so you wonder if Boughton is finally tumbling to the fact that they've actually had the resources not to have such a circumscribed life. I mean, you know, they could have traveled, and maybe it's in the next reading, he talks about how going to Minneapolis was like going to Europe for him. I mean, it just absolutely cracked me up, you know, that, gee, you go to Minneapolis, there are all these different Lutheran churches. I mean, and this is just his idea of, you know, kind of getting out and you know, challenging himself. But yeah, like Jenny says, all these layers and resources that it seems like really have been hoarded and not used for the good even of his own family, and let alone for the greater good.
Yeah, this is reminding me of a couple of things. So that conversation about oh, by the way, Jack and Glory, there's this money that was left to me from my parents or grandparents, I can't quite remember which, that I always intended to just leave there, and then it's, you know, you kids could have it when I died. It comes from, there's a rash of burglaries apparently in town, and Jack believes that everyone suspects that he's the one that did it. And that's why they stop talking when he goes into stores and that sort of thing. And he believes that his dad must know about these things, and that his dad probably thinks that he did it too. And so Reverend Bowden offers this money to Jack, and that they can have access to this money, Jack and Glory can. And Jack, he tells Glory, like, he just did that because he thinks that I stole money. That's why he's doing this. Like, he's not doing it out of really out of the kindness of his heart. He's doing it because he thinks that I'm a scoundrel.
Right.
And you know, and so, and Bowden, we're never clear whether or not Bowden does think that. And so maybe Bowden looks at that, and maybe it is like this moment of growth for him, and this moment of, yeah, I've been hoarding these things and you can't take them with you when you go, and that sort of thing. And yeah, and you should just have access to them now. And maybe it is the way that Jack sees it. But
Yeah, Jack is seriously wounded by that proposal.
Yeah, but of course he doesn't ask, like, are you giving me this money because you think I stole this money? Nobody just asked the question.
That's my point to these conversations, that it's like you start to feel, or I started to feel in this section, like I just kept reading the same thing over and over again, in a way, in terms of them talking. They are, like you said, Damon, they are talking more to each other, but there's so much distrust between the characters, and so much they're reading into everything that's being said to them, and also flat out lying to each other, you know, or like making, like we see Glory resolve. She resolves to herself. She's going to tell Jack that he was flippant. And then Jack catches himself and says, oh gosh, Glory, I'm sorry. I think I was flippant. And she's like, oh no, you're fine. And I just kind of want to go, are you kidding me? Like, you just told yourself that you were going to call him out on it. He acknowledges it and you say he didn't do it. Right. That's just one conversation. And it seems like that happens a lot.
Right. And even Glory says, or she looks at him funny when he says something about $38 and X number of cents. She does a double take and he says, oh, so you think I stole it too?
Yeah.
And she says, I don't know what to think.
And rightfully so, because how would any of them know what to think of each other at this point? Because it doesn't seem to be very clear what they.
Right.
Somebody said something about appearances, I think, in their notes, and then maybe here in conversation this morning. Yeah, just about like they're working so hard for the sake of appearances as a family, and then to each other too, where that just also gets very confused amongst the family members.
Right. At some point, I mean, Glory, I don't think has ever told her father what her, exact experience was. He thinks she got married and the marriage didn't work out. So she hasn't told him that she was never married.
Yeah. I want to talk. Oh, sorry, Constance.
No, and then he says later, Glory was really wounded. And it's sort of like, what? How does he know this? Or anyway, go ahead, Damon.
No, I was just gonna say that I wanted us to talk a bit about Glory, because we spent a lot of time talking about Jack and the Reverend so far, but we learn a bit more about Glory in this section. We learn that her fiance was married to someone else, and that she got kind of led down a path, taken advantage of, and then came back home. But I don't know, what do you think about Glory? What do you think? Are we learning anything about Glory? What's going on with her?
I apologize for doing this, but I'd like to backtrack just a little bit about Jack and the money. And the character, Glory doesn't seem to articulate this unless I missed it, and neither does the Reverend, but seems to me there's a lot of evidence, or there's a lot of kind of emphasis on Jack. Jack is always having a cigarette. Jack is always, getting out cigarettes, and yet supposedly he doesn't have any money. And cigarettes were not expensive then, but you still needed something to pay for them. And so to me, this adds another note of tension. Where is he getting the money to buy these cigarettes? I mean, is it maybe this petty theft? So that's just another layer and another bit of the uncertainty that I think is done very effectively in the novel. I'm sorry, please.
Oh, that's fine.
I'll just butt in on the cigarettes. There is a point at which he comes home with the carton of cigarettes as well as some groceries, and he says, I owe you for these. And so he's intending to pay for them. And Glory, just like, says, we have more money than we need. There's all this extra money, so quit worrying about it. Nobody's worrying about money.
But it does add into the almost stilted nature of their conversations, including the one about Glory's past in terms of Jack. I hadn't noticed that about how he's constantly going out for a smoke, and that's kind of his one thing he's allowing himself to do, because he's trying to stay away from the bars. He's trying to stay put at the house, but he does use that as a means to get out. Like, oh, I'm good. And she even says to him at one point, well, you could smoke in the house, Papa wouldn't care. And he's like, he needs something to help himself, like an excuse to remove himself from the situation. But there is, to circle back to Damon's question about Glory and her past, Jack, and see, look, we're even doing it too. We're trying to talk about Glory and we're talking about Jack. But Jack, when Glory talks to him about her experience and starts to tell him what the man was like, he calls it right away. He's like, oh, what a cad. And I can't tell if it's knowingly or unknowingly insults Glory by like saying, oh, well, that's the kind of man who takes advantage of a vulnerable woman. And she says like a page or two after that of like, well, it didn't kill me for you to say that. But, she's been so worried about being seen, like, for her, what she's now seen as foolishness.
Yeah. And Jack calls it right away because that's like exactly what he did.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. I was going to say, it takes one to know one there.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Glory seems to be doing a lot to kind of keep everyone together in some ways. She this is the closest that Jack comes to admitting that he has a problem with alcohol. He doesn't really actually say that, but really heavily implies it and asks Glory to, one night in particular, to sit with him and keep him away from the bars, keep him in the house until the bars close. Bars, there can't be more than one bar in this town, but whatever. And Gloria's the one that feeds everybody. Gloria, at least when Jack first shows up, Gloria is kind of the go-between between the Reverend and Jack. She spends a lot of time interpreting the two for each other, it seems to me. And part of that seems just kind of out of a sense of familial obligation at times. She tells Jack, I honestly don't know what to think of you. But I'm gonna be, more charitable in my thoughts towards you, if for no reason other than you're my brother.
Well, and I think is this the section where they have the realization, they talk about like or was that in the first one about like, you're not the only sinner in the family? Mm-hmm. And it sort of bonds them together a little bit, that they are, I think we've talked about the similarities between the two of them, and I think they're seeing it in their own relationships with each other too, of like going, oh, okay. I'm sort of not the only one.
I think in this section too, Jack and Glory, oops, go ahead.
No, go ahead. You're good, Constance.
Okay, I think in this section, Jack and Glory really start to become much closer and much more honest with one another. I mean, to the extent that they feel they can be honest. And Glory seems to view Jack much more sympathetically than she did when he was about to come, or when he had just arrived, and intermittently throughout, she gets frustrated with him and sort of thinks he's usurping her position in the family. But I think her growing trust in him or care for him makes me more sympathetic toward him.
Yeah, and along those lines, they have an interesting kind of little snippet of a conversation about Jack's daughter who died. Glory's kind of revealing that my fiance was married and that sort of thing. And Jack asks, he said, but there's no children from this relationship. And she says, no children. And he says, well, at least you avoided that, or something to that effect, which offends Glory because she helped to take care of Jack's child, at least for as long as the child was alive. And she says, and Jack seems to experience this as a source of shame. And Glory says something along the lines of, like, there was more than shame out of that. Like, we loved that child, or we cared for that child, and that child enjoyed their life for as long as they had it. Which I think is some sort of like an urge to Jack to see himself in ways other than as an unrepentant screw up, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
But it reminded me also of, there's this Jacob Esau thing going on with these two as well. Boughton even they even name it in this section, that Jack says, oh yeah, that's, Jack quotes Esau at some point, and Boughton says, no, that's Esau. You're Jacob. And Jack says, yeah, that's right, I'm the one who has to steal the blessing. Which is, man,
there's a lot in that, isn't there?
Yeah.
The line that Jacob quotes is Esau, as he says, bless me also, right? And
Right.
no, you're Jacob, you're not Esau. and to imagine that you felt that you had to steal a blessing from your own family.
But what it makes me think of is back to Gilead, where in a sense he can't get the blessing from his own father, and he gets it from Ames at the end of the novel. Ames does give him a blessing.
Yeah.
But yeah, he says, I'm the smooth man. That's right, I'm the smooth man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's because it's very clearly Jacob and Esau, because the Reverend invites him to come to his bedside where he's dying. I mean, his death isn't imminent, but Boughton is dying. He's getting more and more frail with each day. His scar is getting wider and wider all the time, which means that he's, Glory knows that means that he's exhausted, and there's this sense that he's come home looking for a blessing of some sort. But,
So
it might
you
be
mentioned
interesting. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was, Damon mentioned exhaustion, which I definitely picked up on during this section, which then when I started thinking about it, I was like, oh, this has kind of been throughout, and even goes back to Gilead, because, right, wasn't he up and writing like all the time? Like he wasn't sleeping, he was very restless and things too. So that's a carryover from the first book. But this idea of sleep is, and it's not just the Reverend, it's all of them. I mean, it's Glory at one point says something about how she's going to just like go be in her bed and stare at the ceiling and hate her life until the sun comes up, because she knows like sleep is not coming. And it's Jack is struggling. They're all, no one is resting. And I don't know if that's where we get these moments of testiness with each other and the shortness, or the sort of like the repeated cycles, because they're all just kind of running on fumes at this point.
Yeah. I can't tell if they're worn out from each other or worn out from themselves.
Yeah, from life.
What
Or
does each of the
both.
characters really want? I mean, I think that's might be a worthwhile question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that is a good question, Constance. What do these characters want?
It seems like the Reverend wants everyone to be happy, wants everyone to be joyful, noisy, joyful. Like he remembers the good old days. But when we get the children's perspective of those days of growing up, it wasn't that it was all great. So, I don't know if he's cherry picking in his memories or in his desires, or if he just wants some peace, because he knows that his time is fading.
He seems to want, the one thing that keeps occurring to me that he wants is for Jack to be truly religious.
Mm.
And Jack cannot be.
Yeah.
And he can't lie about it either.
Yeah, that's a good question. So okay, so what does Glory want?
I think she wants to move on. I think she talks about with Jack about wanting to teach somewhere else, right? That she doesn't. Jack mentions that he can maybe see himself staying in Gilead, but Glory seems to be there out of obligation, but also just because of her own circumstance. Like she had nowhere else to go at that point, so she went home. But I don't get the sense that she wants to stay there. She wants to leave and teach and I don't know, maybe have a family. I'm not sure.
There was certainly a vision she had earlier of a family she would have where she would be married to her best friend and have a place where she belonged, and she would call the shots about what it looked like. And
she does mention that that's dead. I don't know if she uses the word dead, but she does say something about that's gone.
mm-hmm.
And of course, the physical house that she envisions as her ideal is like an opposite of this house that she's now living in.
Mm-hmm.
Just pretty interesting too.
Yeah. And in your comments, you made an interesting connection to Robert Frost and to the death of a salesman, and kind of this idea of home. And I'm wondering if you could maybe just say a little bit about that for us.
Well, it seems, I mean, so far, and again, lots of layers in this book, but for both Glory and Jack, this is the place that when you go there, they pretty much have to take you in. And also in Jack's case, and in particular, it's something that he hasn't had to do anything to deserve. And so I think, we kind of have that going on. And also, I mean, I can picture, and I could probably do research and actually find out, but that's a pretty well-known poem for people of a certain age. And I can imagine Marilynne Robinson having some kind of connection in mind. And in a lot of ways, I think it deepens what's going on in the novel. And it also, you know, ties the novel to one of the great American writers, Robert Frost. So, and I'm continuing to think about that also. But as we continue in the book, there are going to be other dimensions and other forms of home that are going to come up, and that'll be interesting. And also the way those maybe somehow relate to the Frost poem, and that idea that they have to take you in, or you don't have to deserve it.
Just, ooh, there's a little preview for us
Yes.
of what's coming. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. This idea of not necessarily deserving or not having earned this place of home, and yet there it is for you, I think also connects with the questions of forgiveness that keep coming up throughout this, right? This, you know, what can a person do to ever really earn someone's forgiveness? And maybe forgiveness is a thing that you just have to offer, regardless of whether or not a person deserves it or can earn it. And but that doesn't make it easy. And the past clings, and it holds on, and all that stuff. So we're about at the point where we might want to start wrapping up our conversation. Any other things that you wanted to make sure that we got a chance to talk about that we maybe skipped over?
The library book was so fantastic. As a, you know, like, here's Jack so concerned about people thinking that he took the $38, and yet he takes a library book without checking it out. And it becomes this whole thing. And then 3 pages later, we realize that it was his father's book that was donated to the library in the first place. And I kind of set the book down and went, oh, that was perfect. That was just,
Yes.
I don't know. It just summed up the whole situation for me in some ways.
Absolutely. Well, and of course, that book is partly about, you know, how should people live and how should they treat each other? You know, what should society be like? And that's a lot of what's being questioned in this novel also.
Yeah, this seems, one of the things that I appreciate this is this is set in the mid 50s, sometime around then, right? That and I hadn't really thought about this, Anne, until you pointed it out, that the difference between an emphasis on personal piety and personal religious responsibility, and an emphasis on communal righteousness and communal justice, and how do we form a loving society and a kind society for everyone, and that isn't that perhaps our ultimate moral and religious obligation. And I hadn't necessarily made that connection between that Bowden seems intent on a personal piety, and not necessarily concerned about extending that then out into the world in that sort of way. And I think there's a tendency sometimes for folks to look particularly at the 1950s as sort of this ideal time in America. And this really sort of undercuts a lot of that, and sort of says, you know, even in the place that you may have thought was paradise in the 1950s, everybody had problems and everybody had struggles, and nothing was ever perfect. And it does it in kind of in subtle ways sometimes,
Yeah.
but and sometimes it does it in really overt ways as well. But other things you wanted to make sure that we got a chance to talk about.
I just wanted to throw out that question that the end of this section posed to us in a way about the read. Like, it's almost like a question of why do we read, which I thought was a very good question for this group, where Jack is reading aloud to his father, and I guess I can't remember what the book even was at this point, but anyway, he said something at some point along the lines of, well, yeah, you can just stop. There's nothing in that that's going to surprise us. And it caught me as a question of, is that why we read? Do we read books to be surprised? I mean, I'm not one who's going to stop reading the book. I mean, I could maybe count on one hand the number of times I've actually given up on a book and walked away. It takes a lot for me to do that. And other people stop books all the time. So that's a personal thing, but I'm curious to know if anyone else noticed that question of like,
Yeah, I did.
why do we read, and what you think about that?
Well, interestingly, that book was about Africa.
Oh, that's right. Yes.
And based on the names that were shared from the book, someone ended up getting killed
Right. Yeah.
at the end of it. And the names seemed to me that the person who got killed seemed like they were probably a native African.
Right.
And the person who did the killing had what I would have thought was a pretty white name.
I was going to say, I think we have like colonialist mentality there for
Mhm.
sure. They wouldn't have called it that. Well, they wouldn't have called it that at the time, but yes.
Yeah. So,
You know,
so
The
then that adds,
white
go ahead.
white saviors are going in there to, help the benighted Africans. And they'll be so grateful. It'll all be just fine.
Yeah. And so, and I don't know if that book that got referenced is a real book or not.
Yes, it is.
It is?
Yep.
Okay.
And it won a National Book Award.
Okay. Yeah.
Do you know anything more about it, Anne?
Well, just what my Google search brought up really quickly. No, I don't.
Okay. It's nonfiction or fiction?
Wait just a second. I've got notes in my book, but okay. About what page are we on in home?
That book is mentioned on page 147 for sure.
Okay, all right, let me think that's where I have my notes. No, my notes are from earlier. I'd have to dig around. It would take us too long, but no, it was a book that was well received at the time.
Something of value is the
Yes.
is the title of the
Mhm.
of the book.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
But it does seem to, the way he reacts to it of like, oh, we know how that ends. It almost is reminiscent of how he responds to the TV and the news and stuff. He's like, well, we don't need to concern ourselves with that.
Yeah,
sort of
that doesn't
mentality.
matter to us, turn off, that if we're not hearing about it and it isn't happening right here in Gilead, it doesn't
Mhm.
matter to us.
Mhm.
Right. Kamani is the child that Peter's playing with at the beginning, isn't he? Those children are playing together.
Mhm.
And Jack nods and he says, I guess he killed him. And Jack closed the book. I guess he did. A pity, the old man said. That seems to be how it is, though. So much bad blood. I think we'd all better just keep to ourselves.
Yes, I underlined that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it gets better, I think. Right? Jack says, I have certainly heard that sentiment before.
Mm.
I know a good many people who agree with you about that, believe me.
Which is a rather diplomatic way of making his point.
Yeah. Yes, we might want to try another book, Jack, don't you think? Seems there's nothing in that one that's going to surprise us. And Jack agrees, not a thing. He nodded, and this is Bowden. The fellow writes well, though. The elephants were very interesting.
Yeah. he is-
Wow.
Yeah.
There's no room for that growth there.
Yeah. Yeah.
What did you say, Jenny?
I said there's no room for that sort of growth in the Reverend. In
Oh,
the sense,
right.
he's not,
No.
Jack's pushing a little bit, and it's not going to
Mm-mm.
Yeah. Yeah.
happen.
Yeah. Say I
Do you think we read to be surprised?
No.
I don't know that I have an answer to that question yet either, but it's an interesting one.
I'm letting the professors take this one.
No one has anything to profess at this moment.
You know,
Well-
I remember actually a seminar that I was in years ago, that Jim Miller, who was at the University of Chicago, was leading. And he recommended, and this was a Willa Cather thing, he recommended that our attitude toward Cather was to submit yourself to the novel and be prepared to be surprised.
Hmm.
And I had not thought of that sentence and that he said until right now. And actually for me, as I've kept reading in my life, that has been pretty good advice, not to have preconceptions and to, be prepared to, and not have my expectations kind of warp my reading.
Interesting.
I
Yeah.
think we read to try on other people's lives and try on their perspectives.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's I sometimes read out of obligation, right? Like just
Mhm.
as a basic point. I think when I am choosing to read, I read to be interested. And sometimes I suppose I can be interested by a surprise. Sometimes I can just be interested by that was fascinating. What I just read. What I read most frequently is the Bible, is scriptures. And most often I'm reading things that I've read multiple times before. And I hope to find new things in them, I suppose. I also want to find myself in it. And find others in it. I think sort of Constance, kind of what you're saying, but
Well, and I think when a person really discovers something new as he or she is reading, that there's a kind of surprise there that that I really value as a reader.
Mhm. Well, I think too, this idea of trying on, I haven't read the part yet about where he's talking about Minneapolis, but like for someone to go from Iowa to Minneapolis is almost a step too far. Reading is a way that allows us to travel and to learn in that way. And also, I think sometimes the surprise comes from not only learning someone else's new experience, but to like learn how similar you are to that person.
Yes.
Even though their world and their life is so different, it's that humanizing element of like, oh, we all have these shared feelings, even if our landscape, our home isn't the same.
it's interesting. Was Glory on the porch for that conversation? Because she taught English, like she taught
Not mentioned. I don't see her
poetry.
Well,
so it would be interesting if Glory heard that comment, what her reaction may
right,
have
where's
been.
her voice in this?
Yeah, because she talks, earlier, she thinks about how she was imploring kids to read things that were kind of beyond them.
Yes. Yep.
So to awaken them to
Mhm.
something, or, yeah, so that'd be interesting to see. So, well, I'm gonna draw us to a close here, but I think that's an excellent sort of question and pondering to end on. Why do we read? So hopefully folks who are playing along at home continue to read. We're gonna have an open conversation next week on Thursday. It must be October 14th. Hold on,
Today's 7th.
15th.
Thursday, October 14th at 6:30. There'll be an open Zoom conversation. So if folks want to join in that, you can let the church know, and I will make sure that I get the link to that to you. And yeah, until then, good reading, I suppose. Thanks to Jenny and to Constance and to Anne, and we'll see you all next time.
Right. Thank you all.
you.
Bye.
Bye.